served in Vietnam and also served in Desert Storm. And he's going to talk to us tonight about Operation Market Garden, which was the operation that kicked off on September 17th, 1944, and was Montgomery's disaster. It's the one he talked Ike into that ended up in practically all of the Brits that actually got into the town of Arnhem were captured. So without further ado, Colonel Bill.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
All you back there? Okay. If you can't, raise your hand and we'll go to the big speaker here, the big mic. All right? Well, listen, thanks again, Bill, and all you folks here. I just wondered if I'd ever be back to see you again, and I found out that I was going to be, and I was pretty excited about that because I feel that the folks up here are probably some of the most patriotic supporters of the military and of our country, and I certainly enjoy being a part of that every time and possibly every day if I can. And you certainly stimulated me the last time I was here, as I hope I'm going to stimulate you. Having said that, I want audience participation. I know some folks out there have had experience in the military. Some of you good-looking guys in World War II, and I'm sure the ladies who are married to those folks who were in World War II know a lot about this too. So we look for audience participation, and of course at the end we'll talk a little bit about this operation. Bill already said it was a screwball disaster for Montgomery, but I'll let you come to your own conclusions. And if that's in fact true, why is it true? Maybe we'll be able to answer some of those unknowns that many historians are still asking to this day. There's still no answers to it. But anyway, set the stage. Sunday, 17th of September 1944 in Arnhem, Holland. There's a Lieutenant Josef Enhammer. He's a Wehrmacht artillery officer, and he's outside just admiring the wonderful weather in Holland at that time of year, and particularly this Sunday. And he looks up, and he sees these snowflakes coming down from the sky. And he says to himself, wait a minute. It never snows in September in Holland. And then he says, that's not snow, those are paratroopers. And that's the spearhead of the 1st British Airborne Division jumping into Arnhem, which sets the stage for what we're going to talk about tonight. And what we're going to talk about is just an overview of what happened in that particular operation and looking at things that led up to it. Why do we have this particular exercise operation put together as it was and executed as it was, and what the outcome was? So there's a lot of things we want to look at. But to set the stage for Arnhem, Nijmegen, and Eindhoven, which are the major jump objectives for the Allied Airborne, quote unquote, the 1st Allied Airborne Army. That's a term you may or may not be familiar with. It came about in August, and the Brits, General Brereton was the commander of this unit, and it was an attempt to bring all the airborne forces under one umbrella for better command and control. Unlike during Normandy, where it was pretty much under the armies that they fell under, this is one overall arching army. So we're gonna look at that. But looking at the first slide up there, when I left you, how many were here for my Normandy presentation? Okay. And at the end of Normandy, we talked about where the Allied forces were in relationship to the Germans and what some of the outcomes were at that point. Well, subsequent to Normandy, the beachhead, you had the breakouts with Patton's Third Army. You had on July 31st the Avranches breakout. That was a heavy bombing, Allied bombing, followed by a breakout from there with Patton had Falaise Gap, 21 August, about, where we almost trapped the entire 5th Army and the 7th Panzer Armies. I say almost because we got a lot of them, but there's estimates of maybe 50 to 60,000 did escape. I tend to believe that in light of what you're going to see later on when we talk about market garden. You wonder where the Germans get all this stuff. So a number of units did get away. They did get out. And where we thought we could shorten that war, we had a continuation of the fight, if you will. By the 3rd of September, the British Army's into Belgium, into Brussels, and by the 4th of September, they were able to capture Antwerp. Now, why is Antwerp important? It's important. Well, who can tell me why it's important? Port City. Just yell it out. That's all right. Yell it out. Why is the port important? Supplies. You see, we have a lot of people who need supplies now. You know, that original invasion force of maybe 50 to 60,000 has escalated, of course, with the follow-on to 4 armies now. But so ports are important. However, we have Antwerp, but what don't we have?
We have the Gordon.
The Allens in the estuary.
That's right. This is just another British deal, but let's see if this works. What I want to do, and this is just a it's not a very good map representation, but I hope. Can we turn that one off, please, Laura? Yep. Maybe that'll help you. Unless you guys have got X-ray vision back there. Okay.
Focus.
It's well, listen, you got your reading glasses here, your long reading. Okay, I'm not going to belabor this map. I know it's shaking too, but I just want to make it. Here's Antwerp, okay, the port. But the port's an inland from maybe 20-some miles from the sea, from the North Sea. The Germans control all of this. So what good is that port with the Germans in control of it? Not much. So we may have this, but we don't have the access to it, and there's a problem. We'll show later where the Germans actually held that up, and then were able to escape from there. That's another story, but that's the situation as far as Antwerp goes. So it's really not that effective, and it would take a while to get the forces. In fact, I understand there were ships lined up in October. This is September now? October, still waiting to get into port. It wasn't until November that they could get them in there and have any useful supply. Yes, sir. Louder. Okay.
You were good when you started, but
Well, hey, you guys are tiring me out. Bill, is this
Technical assistance.
yeah, my technical. Clark Swallow is my technical advisor. How's that? Okay. Now, if it's too loud, raise your hand. Okay, so what good's a port without access to it? Well, that's a valid question. All right. So we'll leave that for debate later on in the presentation. But what you're seeing here, by early September, the Allied forces have moved faster than the plan called for them to move and expected them to move. And you look at the Third Army and Patton, you know how fast he was moving across France and well over the Seine, and he was moving so fast they couldn't keep him fueled. And that wasn't just Patton's army, it was all the others too that having supply and logistics problems. His army was on the Moselle by Metz, so that's right up, getting close to the German borders in the Saar, where he was targeting at that point in the war and his plan. And we want to keep pressure right? You keep pressure on the enemy, so he can't what? Reorganize, regroup. And that gives you that momentum and that edge that you need to keep. Because what's going to happen, it's like you're in a fight. As soon as you let up, the guy's going to reorganize and maybe counterattack. Well, that's part of what we're going to talk about too. So the attempt to keep the pressure up, though, by early September, things started to slow down, right? Why'd they slow down? That's a question for you people to answer. But supplies, logistics, it's all common sense. That's why I can't figure out why we have bad operations planned and executed. Because if you use common sense, you won't do stupid things. But there's a bunch of that going on in this operation. Basically, you got the answers anyway, logistics problems, all right? There was an argument within the SHAEF headquarters between Eisenhower and Montgomery. One was Eisenhower wanted a broad front attack across Europe, and Montgomery wanted a single thrust to punch through and exploit. So there was these conflicting strategies, if you will. And maybe there's merit to that in that 4 armies, you'll see the Army breakdown here. The 21st Army Group, you had the 2nd British Army, and you had the 1st Canadian Army. In the 12th Army Group, you had 1st Army under Hodges and the 3rd Army under Patton. Well, that's a lot of material and manpower to maintain. So Montgomery's saying, hey, we can't possibly support logistically all these armies and move on a front almost simultaneously, if you will, towards Germany. We need a single thrust, a single movement. Now, where were the supplies coming from at this point in the war? Well, they were emanating from England, but what ports in Europe were going to be able to receive them? You had Cherbourg. That's it. You had Cherbourg. Now you're going to say, but Bill, there's Le Havre, well, that's true. There are other ports, but they were certainly distant, and certainly at that point had not been captured. The movement kind of not cut off, but didn't consider priority to the northern part of Le Havre, up that part of France into Belgium and Holland. That was the thrust was through France primarily in movement, and therefore we didn't have the ports. But Cherbourg was 400 miles away. We didn't have what else? We didn't have wheeled vehicles to move all this stuff. Now we did have air supremacy, so the threats from the air were minimal, but we didn't have the wherewithal. The rails, well, what did we do to the rail system in France? They bombed the crap out of it. Why? So the Germans couldn't use it. Well, now we've got a problem and we can't really use it. Oh, but that's how it goes. So they were working the Allies were working to rebuild the rails as best they could, but that still couldn't meet the demands. So, to say the least, the momentum had died in the Allied forces. And now Eisenhower is thinking about, well, what was it going to take to re-energize? The first Allied airborne army I mentioned earlier, there were a number of, it's like you've got a resource and you need to use it. Use it or lose it, is how they say, or if it doesn't work, if you don't keep working it, it breaks. Well, every time they planned an operation, by the time they had the operation ready to be executed, the Allies had advanced beyond the drop zones. They were no longer necessary. So this is one of the things that are in the minds of others in the higher commands, thinking about how we're going to best apply this force we have, how can we effectively utilize it, because we have it here. By the end of August, early September, with supply shortfalls in the Allied forces, losing of momentum. When you lose momentum, what are the Germans going to do? Regain momentum. And they can do it better than anybody. Ike gives the go to Monty for Operation Market Garden in September of '44. I must be dyslexic. It's rough. I'm not going to get an A in graphics, I can see that. But this is just to give you a perspective, a geographical perspective. What are the Germans doing while all this is going on? You just think they're sitting back waiting to wave the white flag? Huh? No. No, they aren't. Why aren't they? I mean, look at from June to August how decimated their forces have been. From Normandy to the breakout to the Mortain counterattack in Normandy that was devastating to the armies after Hitler thought that that's the way to check Patton's breakout. Look at the figures. Consistently, constantly harassed by air. They don't have air parity, let alone supremacy. They pretty much have lost control of the air, so they're getting bombed constantly. Every time they move, there's a thunderbolt or well, 51s too, but or a British typhoon on them. Clobbering. Units, divisions, Panzer divisions that are maybe 50% or less in strength. You'd say, this is right, this whole situation now is right for a surrender, wouldn't you? Well, no, not with the Germans. They're not going to do that. I am one of them, and I know how thick-headed and stubborn we are, and this just carries over, and it's multiplied by the fact that what's happening here, what's happening, as a book I've read, and I'm going to refer to it, the book is It Never Snows in September, which is the Germans' perspective of the war. And they talk about, we don't buy into all this nationalist, socialist crap. We don't believe in what Hitler's doing anymore. We know the war's lost, but hey, they're on our homeland. They're on our doorstep, and we're not going to just give up. We've got to fight on and do our duty, and hopefully two things may happen. Maybe both, but nonetheless. The ultimate goal was that they didn't see any way they're going to win the war, but they might be able to come out with some kind of a peace treaty with terms a little more reasonable than unconditional surrender. So those were reasons and motivators. Also, they had these V2 rockets. You familiar with the V2s? Those are these secret, super-duper weapons that were going to turn the tide of battle. That plus the 262ME jet plane and some other fantastic stuff. So they believed in these weapons. It's like, hey, you always want to have hope. And they did. And they had the motivators to keep fighting within themselves. But beyond that, they had a general staff that was par excellent, equal to none, or none equal to it, I should say. We'll highlight some of that. So our homeland's threatened. It's like equipment you get. Must be government issued. I'll just have to yell a little louder. September, how's that? Doing okay? Early September, the whole situation's changed. And if you saw, many of you have seen the movie Bridge Too Far, where at the beginning of that movie you just see these German forces in chaotic retreat without any semblance of reorganizing. They're just getting out of it. Well, that suddenly flipped around by early September. A couple things happened. Going back to that original map I showed you, the Brits failed to close that estuary where the German Army, 15th German Army, of about 80,000 soldiers was able to cross over the sea there and move on into Holland. So they found an escape route. Once again, the Brits were a little slow on the uptake and didn't do what they needed to do.
Magic. Von Rundstedt's back. Remember von Rundstedt? Okay? He was the OBK West, Oberkommander West. He was the main German in command of the western part, the Western Front for Germany. Well, after Normandy, he got bounced, and he's brought back now by Hitler because he's one of the brilliant minds, and Hitler knows he needs this guy. And he was one of those who was not implicated in the July 20th attempt to assassinate the Fuhrer. So he still has his head on him. Model, who was holding that position, was moved down to the Army Group B command. Both excellent staff, excellent commanders. So you've got some of the best guys working here. And you've got a guy named Student, General Student. He commands the German Airborne Army. It's called an army, a parachute army, but it's just a paper exercise because there's really no numbers, if you will, of Fallschirmjägers to fill it. But nonetheless, it's a headquarters area where they can fill underneath it. What you'll hear the term crust. What was happening now, the Germans were building a crust, reestablishing a system and a control arm and filling units. And what they were doing, as units were retreating out of France into Holland or wherever, that have units to greet them as they were retreating and turn them around and reorganize them into a fighting force. Primarily to continue defensive battles along the Siegfried Line and certainly on the canals, the Albert Canal, which is the one of the boundaries between Holland and forms one of the boundaries between Holland and Germany. On 5 September, something interesting happens that's going to have a big impact on this battle to come. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps moves, the commander Bittridge moves the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions into Arnhem to rest and refit, to cross-level equipment. The 10th was pretty well decimated, so they were expected to go back into Germany and regroup. Now, what they were regrouping with, personnel-wise, you can imagine, you saw those figures about the casualties from the Normandy up till September period, very high for the German army. And you're saying, where are they getting all these people from? Where are they getting these soldiers from? Some, but they were taking younger people and older people. Not as well trained, but nonetheless, with good leadership, could probably hold their own. And you have to say they did a pretty damn good job of it, at least for the next year, because this war went on, well, not quite that long, but it's still a long fight. In Eindhoven and Arnhem, which are the areas we'll be concentrating on, you had these ad hoc units, I call them, because they were just a bunch of guys brought together under a structure and organized to function either as infantry, possibly as a motorized force or a panzer unit. So it was a hodgepodge. But there's a lot of hodgepodges out there that had an impact, particularly going up against airborne forces, which are light. And not well supplied over time, which is another bone of contention, and we'll talk about that. Plus, there's an SS training battalion up in Arnhem, and an NCO, and these guys are the cream of the crop, so they do cause some problems for the Brits up there. Intelligence. You know the joke about intelligence officers, don't you? Something about it. An oxymoron, right? You have to ask yourself, in this case, it might be true. The Germans had a good handle on what they expected to happen. They saw the Second Army, Second British Army was getting a lot of replacements in the area that they were positioned, reinforcements, and they expected offensive right into through Arnhem. It's almost like they had the script. Now, there's a story that they did have the battle plan, but we'll talk about that later. And of course, the airborne troops to be used. Now, something I think you have to be aware of, and it might lend more clarity to this whole thing. What is Arnhem close to? Rhine River, what else? Well, the bridge is a way to get over the Rhine, but when you get over the Rhine, what do you have waiting for you? You have the Ruhr. The industrial base of Germany is in the Ruhr. Here's Arnhem, Nijmegen. This is the area that the operation will occur in. Right here's the Ruhr River and its tributaries, and all the industrial base, the primary industrial base of Germany is right there, 60 miles away. Is this cause for concern, and would you think it to be an important strategic target to take? Anybody say no? Okay. See, you guys are intelligent. You know, it's clear as day, as clear as night follows day and day follows night to me. The Ruhr, of course, that was always an objective. It wasn't like a big secret to anybody. But you can imagine when you're that close to, number one, your homeland and your industrial base, you're going to fight like hell to make sure that they don't take it. Also, you'll see, if you follow the Siegfried Line, which is the border between Holland, Belgium, France, Holland, Belgium primarily, Germany and those countries, the Siegfried Line would have pretty much ended just about the Ruhr area, and then of course this would be a flanking action around that. So there's a lot of things that the Germans realized would be important, and this is where the Allies are coming. And they were afraid of their 15th Army, which was to the west of the Arnhem area, as being cut off. Now, what were the Allies' intelligence saying about this whole operation? You familiar with the term Ultra? Ultra. That's an encrypting system that was intercepting Bletchley Park in England, was where all these geeks were located. The early geeks were located there. These brain guys who could decipher and decode and break code. Ultra said there's going to be a 9th and 10th Panzer Division in Arnhem. Now, should you be concerned about that? If you're in the airborne, I think you should. Aerial photos and the Dutch resistance said the same thing. But you know what? They were saying, well, the Dutch resistance been compromised, so we can't trust their input. There may or may not have been some of that, but nonetheless, there was a bunch of credible input sources that were validating the fact that there was a lot of formations, armor-heavy formations in the Arnhem area. And we said, well, we've beaten the crap out of these guys. They must be decimated. How can they continue to fight? They're spread pretty thin, and their armor certainly has been degraded, depleted. We also saw increasing flak units occurring. So these are things that you start to maybe do some intelligence analyzing, and you say, maybe we should think about or rethink where we're going to drop these airborne guys in Arnhem. And of course, the Luftwaffe was not a factor at this point. So these are the things that the Intels was looking at, hopefully to allow the commanders to make a good, intelligent decision in the battle plan. Okay, what is the plan? Well, we want to cross the Rhine at Arnhem. We want to flank the Siegfried Line. Who's that on the map? Oh, here it is. I'm sorry. It's a fairly rough graphic, but I think it'll help us understand this whole thing from a geographical perspective.
Just to orient.
There's Arnhem, there's the Niederrhein. That's the primary objective, if you will, to cross that and strike, as you saw on the other map, strike the Ruhr, southeast, 60 miles. Now there's another issue. The V2 sites located in the western part of Europe, Belgium, some in Holland, because these had greater range, so they didn't have to be that close to the coast. So we felt it was imperative that we be able to take those sites out so they wouldn't continue to inflict death and destruction on Britain. These are some of the drivers here as far as the mission goes. There were two phases to Market Garden. One was the market plan, the airborne piece, and the other was the garden plan. That was the armor force, the 30th Corps, British, that would go up the road. Quite simply, there were 3.5 airborne. 101st Airborne had the objective to land around Eindhoven and secure the bridges over the Wilhelmina Canal, Willems Canal, the Domel, and be prepared to protect those bridges and those roadways for the 30 Corps. 30 Corps was down on just below the Dutch-Belgian border. They would come up the highway. Distance of about 64 miles. This is to be done in 2 days. A little ambitious, I think. But 101st had then, 82nd had a couple other missions. In addition to the bridges at Nijmegen and the Graaf and the Maasval Canal at Heumen, they had to take Groesbeek. Groesbeek Heights is one of the only pieces of high ground in all of Holland. 300 feet elevation. It's the Alps to the Dutch, right? But it's also a key piece of terrain because those heights control the roadways, highways, if you will, up from from the southern and northern, depending, but they control the Route 69 roadway movement. Just east of there is the Reichwald, which is the forests of the empire. This is Germany, so we're pretty close to the border here. You know, we're right on the doorstep. And that was something that the 82nd had mission to do. Now, this mission will play a little bit out as we talk about the execution, because it caused them to have to take resources to do that. When they had the Nijmegen Bridge to take, which was a pretty substantial waterway. Okay, you had the 82nd, the 1st British Airborne Division would land near Oosterbeek, and their objective was to take the bridge at Arnhem. Now, Oosterbeek, 6 miles from Arnhem, and had a little walk there with some problems. The first Polish Independent Airborne Brigade was to land south of the Rhine River and support the British Airborne at Arnhem. They also had a mission to capture a railroad bridge there, but their basic job was to reinforce. Now, how many of you can plan a trip in 1 week effectively? Or some activity? I think it's a challenge, depending on maybe what we have to work with, resources, etc. This whole operation was put together in 1 week. And I think you'll see how that impacted, or the impact of that on the operation's outcome. So there wasn't a lot of time to rehearse, to train together, because there's a lot of moving parts here. You've got Brits and Americans and Poles, and coordinating and synchronizing all that's pretty complicated operation. And to do it in 1 week without all the without the opportunities to work out those little problems you have is a big challenge. One other factor, you'll see how that played. All these things have some impact in the long run. You know, it's the old story. If you take care of the little things, the big things take care of themselves. Well, a lot of little things were not taken care of and thought through, and therefore the big things didn't get taken care of, and tragedy occurred because of it. You had 34,600 paratroopers. That's a lot of people in the air, and gliders, okay? And you had, well, 1,400 about C-47s. The point is, you couldn't get them all in on the first day. So you had a plan for the second day and maybe third day. And we'll talk a little bit about weather issues too, which can impact on airplanes. You know, you don't fly when it's rainy, you don't fly when it's foggy, you don't fly if you can't see the ground. That was the market plan. The garden plan was for 30 Corps, a 2-lane road to drive up Route 69, 64 miles in 2 days to relieve the airborne at Arnhem and to cross the Rhine. Now, 64 miles isn't too far. Even in a 2-lane road, if you've got, and you have all, you know, there's no traffic coming south, it's all going north. They were to start, as I showed you there, from the Schelde-Maas Canal Bridge on the Belgian side of the Dutch-Belgian border. Four days, correction, 4 days. 4 days is pretty long for an airborne force to stay in conflict or in battle. And I correct myself, it was the 4th day that it was supposed to be at Arnhem. which then extends that planning figure, because 2 days is where they figure that's the max an airborne force can sustain itself without reinforcements or resupply. And you know, when you're a planner, any of you guys plan military exercises, operations? There's a colonel I know, he's done it. You factor in all those things that can go wrong, you know, all those contingencies, and if you factor in the fact that, one fact, well, maybe we can't get all the resupply in within 2 days. Or reinforcements, or those other factors that figure into it. If that's the case, then maybe we should relook at our planning or our timetable. So that was a big issue. And you'll see this went longer than 4 days. Excellent. All right. Any of you been to Holland? Oh, yeah, okay. What's your impression of Holland's terrain? Flat and wet. A lot of water. A lot of water. And this is not even in the east where the Zuiderzee, but this is a lot of water there. A lot of rivers, canals, etc. And the six major waterways to be navigated or crossed, if you will, with the Wilhelmina Canal, 100 feet, Zuid-Willems, Maas, 800 feet. That's pretty big. Pretty big. I'm sure some of you have been at these rivers, haven't you? Some of you have done Market Garden or the route. Some big waterways. Now, for smaller canals and rivers, bridging with engineers is certainly a plausible, workable plan. Given ideal conditions, and I mean ideal conditions, nobody's firing at you or bombing you or shelling you. But those bigger waterways, the Waal at Nijmegen, the Maas River, and even the Wilhelmina on the Son, that Son, they're requiring a little more. Hopefully, bridges taken intact, because if they aren't, then you've got a major problem in keeping your timetable, because you're not going to throw those bridges up that quickly across those sizable waterways. Now, where was the bridging material? If you needed it, way back in the column. Imagine a core on line, one tank behind the other, and the bridging materials at the back of it. Well, how do you get it to the front? Because you just don't drive around. It's not like we do here. Get on the shoulder and go. You know what the shoulder is in this? Water, swamp, marshy land. They're very restricted. This whole operation, this armor, was restricted to that roadway. Another planning factor and another issue. You can see the Highway 69 is a raised road, 2 lanes wide, soft shoulders and dikes, topped with trees and bushes, which makes observation difficult. So now you're up there exposed with your armored and your wheeled vehicles, and you can't see what may be forward or ahead of you that could fire at you and ruin your day. I mentioned earlier the high ground. There's only 2 pieces. One was in northwest Arnhem, and the other was the Gross Peak Heights, 300 feet. And the key to holding that road. Okay, now you're all wondering, when are we going to start the battle, right? Well, we're going to start it right now. We'll wait no longer. Day 1 was the 17th of September, midday. 20,000 dropped on those particular drop zones I mentioned to you. Eindhoven with the 101st, around Nijmegen with the 82nd, and Oosterbeek for the 1st British Airborne Division. No problems. In fact, if you already talk to anybody, have any of you talked to veterans of this jump? No? Well, I have. and they said it was just it was like the best jump they made in the whole war. And for the initial jump, of course, nobody was firing at them. It was just a nice sunny day. Unlike Normandy, which was the airborne operation was a disaster. And it was just landing in nice soft fields. And I'll show you one of those later when I got a photo of the Eindhoven drop zone. There was some enemy flak, but it was fairly inaccurate. And of course, the Germans were caught by surprise. So there wasn't a lot of resistance to the drop itself. 82nd, they seize their high ground, they seize the bridges they have to take, except one, the bridge at Nijmegen, which will become a key problem as we will talk about. One of the problems was communications with the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. It was late afternoon by the time they got the word to take that bridge. And I don't know, Gavin still hasn't answered the question on that one, and may certainly never will, how that breakdown occurred. But because the 82nd couldn't get to the Nijmegen Bridge and take it on D-Day, the 17th, the Germans had a SS Panzer unit that came down the road from Arnhem. The 9th SS Recon. It was a recon unit of their division. And they took the bridge. So now the Germans got Nijmegen Bridge, where at the initial drop in, there were only 12 soldiers guarding that bridge. Now you've got a recon battalion of Germans on the bridge. So within a few hours, the Germans reacted very quickly and got forces where they needed to have them to affect the outcome of the battle. 1st Airborne, British Airborne. When I say first, that's 1st British Airborne. Okay? They could only drop half the division on day one. Of that half, the 1st Brigade was the one who dropped in, and they moved immediately to take the objective. But because they couldn't get everybody in the first day, they had to secure and defend the drop zones for the second day. What does that cause you to do? It caused you to split your force and put enough force there to defend the drop zone for the follow-on drop. So what's happening is you've got one half of one brigade attacking the objective that was established for the entire division. So you do the math and tell me if you think you got enough combat power to do that job, in light of the fact you've got a 9th and 10th Panzer Division waiting for you. Division Commander Urquhart locates at Osterbeek. That's about it's about 6 miles. I misnoted that. 4 to 6 miles from the drop zone. Now, of that brigade, that was the forces of the 1st and 3rd Battalion, and were taking the northerly route to get to the bridge. And they ran into a lot of resistance, especially from that NCO training unit that was up there. Remember that SS unit I told you, that NCO SS training? Caused a lot of problems for the 1st and 3rd Battalion. The 2nd Battalion under Colonel John Frost, he took the southerly route along the river road, and he was able to, with minimal resistance, to reach the bridge. Now most of you all saw, how many saw A Bridge Too Far? You remember Frost gets in there into the town right by the bridge and secures the bridge on the north end. We'll talk about what happened after that. One of the big problems, I mentioned commo problems. You know, we can understand what that means. Communications, you know, that's the thing women and wives and their husbands have problems with all the time. Communication. And I think it's universal. But in this particular case, it was catastrophic because it impacted on the outcome in many, many ways. If you can't communicate, you can't control and command anything. Well, first of all, the range of the radios, the bridge is about 6 miles, let's say, give or take, from the drop zone. And 6 miles from the headquarters, Mercard, and the division headquarters. But the range of the radios was 3 miles. They had a math problem, obviously. Not just that, but the frequencies, there's crystals. At these times, they preset the frequencies with crystals. And the frequencies were all screwed up. In fact, some of these radios were more effective talking to the Germans. And they got the German stations and they got the BBC, believe it or not. But they couldn't reach each other. That was brought out in the movie, I think, if you remember that. Close air. There were 2 American communication units that dropped in with them with these low frequency systems to help them communicate with the air support, tactical fighters, the fighter bombers, to provide the air support for them. And those frequencies or those crystals weren't tuned properly, so they couldn't communicate with the air support. Antenna length. Any of you been in the Army in infantry? You know, length of antenna could be a factor in your effectiveness in communication. Urquhart set the 4-foot antenna, which at that time of year and those atmospheric conditions was not the right length to have. I guess he got some bad input or advice. So at the for the 1st Division, by the end of day 1, they were defending the drop zone at Osterbeek, and they secured the north end of the bridge, and they made attempts to probe across the bridge to the south, but they weren't effectively. They were fought back, or they were beaten back, and not able to take anything further. 30 Corps, I told you where they're starting. They're starting down here, just below the Dutch border, and they're heading north. 14:35 hours, they begin moving. They got a big artillery preparatory barrage ahead of them to take out any potential anti-tank weapons units and resistance forces. The Irish Guards led. They got ambushed as soon as they crossed into Holland, pretty much, with Germans dug in with anti-tank weapons that they were supposed to not have there, be taken out. And what happens now, when you're on a narrow road, you can't maneuver off that road. What do you do when you're getting fired on, especially if the lead tank's taken out? You know, well, you got to push them off into the marsh. It's a challenge. You can't flank maneuver. Needless to say, their objective on the first day, the 30 Corps' objective, was to reach Eindhoven. And they didn't get there. They made 7 miles and they reached Wallenswaard. They had about another 8 miles to Eindhoven. So they're already behind schedule in their movement. Now it's critical because their movement, synchronized with the airborne simultaneous security of the bridges, allows the plan to flow as it's supposed to in 4 days achieve the objective. Day 2, so 18th of September. By the time the 101st got to that bridge, you remember the movie, the thing blows up in front of them? That's pretty true to the story, if you will. So the Son Bridge is taken out. And 101st, being good airborne troops, say, well, look, let's go find another bridge close by. And they do. They try to take here's the Son Bridge on the Wilhelmina Canal. They go over and attack and try to take the bridge at Best, which is just to the west, short couple miles to the west. But they're not able to take that bridge right away. They can't break through. By this time, the second day, the 101st is linked up with elements of the 30 Corps, who says, we got Bailey bridges. And guess where the Bailey bridges are? In the column to the back. So they have to wait for those Bailey bridges to come up, and then the engineers and German POWs actually help put up the bridge. About 10 hours, but more delays, more delays. Every time that delay, every minute that delay occurs is one less minute that Airborne's going to be able to hold on in Arnhem. Because what did I tell you? 2 hours, right? 2 hours. 2 days. On day 2, the 101st, the first is fighting on at to hold the north side of the bridge, because now what's happening? The Germans are reinforcing their troops in that area to dislodge them. (200) of the 1st and 3rd Battalion, that's not too many troops. They were pretty well battered. But they got to Arnhem. They didn't get to the bridge, but they got into Arnhem. Not that they could do much at that point, but they were there. And the 4th Brigade does drop in. That's their 4th Brigade of the division drops in. So they got another brigade on the ground. But it's not quite where it needs to be at this point. Day 3, fighting continues. They're still holding on at Arnhem by their fingernails. (101st) now, of course, 30 Corps is pretty much moving through there. But the Germans continue to counterattack and cut roads. You know, it doesn't take much to cut that road, 2 lanes. I think we all here could do that real easily. But they did cut the road quite frequently, particularly between Wegel and Uden, among other places. So what does that mean? That means that forces are further delayed, right? That's further setting back the timetable. Because it's easy to cut that 2-lane road. There's no real opportunity to flank and to take. The first, let me back up a minute. Bad weather. 325 is the airborne, or the parachute regiment of the 82nd. Not the parachute, the glider regiment. That's the glider forces. And they were planned to be in that day to reinforce. Well, because of the weather problems in England, they can't get off the ground, so they're still in England. And there's one regiment, the 82nd has to operate, less one regiment. 1st Para Brigade up there in Arnhem still trying to deal with the bridge issue. Attacks are failing. Now what the Germans are doing, they realize they're taking casualties in this house-to-house fighting. And for any of you who understand battle or combat in built-up areas, it's the most challenging and the most dangerous fighting there is. So the Brits are suffering, and so are the Germans. So the Germans said, to hell with this crap, pardon my French. We're going to just demolish these buildings. We'll either shell them, or we'll fire into them, direct fire with tank fire, and literally destroy them. And when they do that, of course, they destroy the ability of the Brits to defend those particular buildings. And that devastated that whole area around the bridge, the city. In fact, if you go there today, there's not a building standing that was there during World War II. So that was their strategies at that point. It was pretty effective because it really, and you'll see when we get to the next day, it have an impact on that little 2nd Battalion that's still hanging on. Now the 4th Para Brigade's on the ground, but they're unable to do anything. And what they decide to do is, okay, we can't get to the bridge, but let's strengthen our defensive positions around Oosterbeek and the headquarters. So they establish a bridgehead right on the Rhine, just at Oosterbeek. I guess they were figuring that let's get defensive, we'll go into defensive positions more, and let's attempt to attack and wait for 30 Corps to come and save us all. First Polish Para unit under Akabowski, General. They got anti-tank guns in and some vehicles, but not their brigade. This is all through gliders. Day 4, boats arrive in the afternoon for the 504. 1500 they cross the river, attack the north end, 505th on the south, and they secure the bridge by about 7:10 p.m. That's 24-hour clock. That's military time, but it's 7:10. German attack Groesbeek Heights, because that's where the 82nd's lodged to protect the bridge or protect the roadway. Try and cut it. On the 4th, the Germans retake the bridge at Arnhem. There's a truce called to allow the wounded to be evacuated, treated, and Colonel Frost becomes a prisoner of war. Majority of the forces there were captured, and that pretty much ended the battle at the bridge, which changed the whole complex of the operation. Now what you have, what I said earlier, you have the 4th Paras and the rest of the division, whatever is there, in defensive positions around the Hartenstein Hotel, which is where the headquarters was. Okay, the war's almost over here. Hang in. Well, Nijmegen Bridge is captured. And that was a last major waterway before Arnhem. This is on day 5. What did 30 Corps do? Horrocks stops the Corps for 18 hours, and his answer was, well, Gavin's beyond, incredulous. How can you do this? You may have heard that line. You've got your soldiers on Arnhem, and you're sitting here doing nothing. And Horrocks said, well, we're reorganizing and trying to sort out the confusion. Now, because the 82nd didn't capture it on day 1, they factored in, well, that's 36 hours delay, time to reinforce. And those are questions for Gavin, and I guess, he probably has to deal with that issue. 30 Corps, they're still waiting for 30 Corps up in Arnhem, 3,500, what's left of them. The resupply attempts were disrupted by the Luftwaffe. The only effective Luftwaffe attack of the entire operation. With the air and the anti-tank, anti-aircraft elements that were on in that area, they were able to shoot down 15 supply aircraft, C-47s, or I'm sorry, Halifax British planes. The Polish are finally here. After 2 days of delay, they get into the battle at about 5 on day 5. But their supply drops are 9 miles from where they are. You know, just a comedy of errors, but not a very sad comedy. Now, not only the supplies drop, but they're supposed to have a ferry to take them across the Rhine River. They drop, remember I said earlier, they drop south of the Rhine, near Drill. Yeah, here's the Rhine, they're over here. They're supposed to have a ferry to take them across to the north, to where the first British Airborne is. And the ferry's not where it's supposed to be. It turns out it was destroyed anyway, so that wasn't available to them. And by the way, you cross that bank where you're supposed to cross, the enemy's entrenched and firing at you. So it was just a bad deal for the Poles that day. They withdrew the drill, and I said chaos. Chaos continues here. Germans redeploy against them on day 6, day 7. Attacks and counterattacks continue. The 325 finally gets to the battle, but it's too late to affect any outcome. 30 Corps opens the road. Day 8, road's cut, open cut, and the Allies abandoned the Rhine River crossing operation. They figure it's a bridge too far. And they established defensive lines around Nijmegen. This is like the trace. Here is now the trace of the Allied forward lines in defensive positions. And the first Airborne, as many as can, try to withdraw across the Rhine River to the south. Day 9, they finish their withdrawal, and Market Garden ends. That's 9 days of hell and chaos, if you will, for those forces that had the misfortune, if you will, to be a part of that tragedy. I say tragedy because it was just miscalculations and poor planning and a lot of other factors. Okay. Any questions before we talk about, look at some things I think to consider, obvious things you might think about.
Where did they capture all of this? Is that at Arnhem?
Yeah. Around Arnhem and between Arnhem and Oosterbeek and in that area. The forces just were not able to fend off the German attacks because we talked about the kind of forces they had to contend with. Those were most of the POWs occurred. There may have been some throughout the whole theater or the whole area of operation. Anything else? Any comments? Yes, sir.
Timeline on this thing here. What was happening here in the other sections our forces?
Patton was sitting pretty still.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. He didn't have the boots to work with.
No. This whole operation took, I would say, a majority of the logistical material from the other armies to support this. It certainly took all the airborne force that would be capable of supporting the other armies, as well as the supply. Whether it was ever in, I would say a lot of it never got to England, never got to Holland. But it was dedicated in England to support them. Now, it fell apart in 9 days when it was supposed to end in 4 days. But then to redirect all that supply is just another challenge, and it did happen after this because Patton was back on the move. But, he was pretty much, you've heard some of his commentary about having all this taken from him so they could support this operation.
It was basically Montgomery was the architect of this Market Garden place.
Yes, it was a Montgomery special. And, some things that were happening. By this time in the war, the main supplier of forces to allies was the U.S. And they wanted and expected to control it. You know, right after D-Day, right after the breakout, Eisenhower took over the ground command responsibilities from Montgomery, which didn't make Montgomery happy. He went back to commanding the Army Group. And in his ego, I mean, you know, just big as all outdoors. And this was, you know, he was constantly arguing with Eisenhower about single thrust. You know, it ought to be his army, his thrust north, and let the others be limited actions or deter other actions other than the main attack.
Bill, was there any truth about the Germans capturing or finding a briefcase of the complete plan?
I haven't read it recently, but I have read and heard of it, that when the Brits dropped into Arnhem, one of the gliders was shot down. And in that glider was the entire plan for Market Garden.
Where all of everything was.
Force dispositions, objectives, timelines, the whole plan was in there. I heard that. Now, you know, it hasn't. I don't think it's been publicized too much, but I've heard that happened.
One other thing. Shortly after this took place, after the 9 days, when Eisenhower gave in the money to give him everything, the term came out, Eisenhower is the best general the British had.
Yeah. Well, Montgomery didn't think Eisenhower knew a damn thing about leading an army in the field.
Yeah.
And I can't argue that necessarily, but I don't know that Montgomery knew much better about it. I think Pat was our ace. I mean, everybody's ace for that matter. The Germans even thought that. Yeah, but you know, Eisenhower had a very difficult position. I think you had to be, I know Patton could have never done that job, nor could I have, because you had to be pretty diplomatic and try to get everybody to work together. And you've got two divergent cultures in some cases, and certainly we're divided by a common language. Yeah, it's a challenge. It was a challenge for Eisenhower. I think under the circumstances, he did the best job, and probably the best guy for that job. But I think this whole operation showed the failings or the weaknesses of Montgomery. And the interesting thing was Montgomery was very cautious, you know, through the campaigns in North Africa, through Normandy, and this is anything but a cautious plan. You know, if you think about it, this is something Pat would have said is audacious, audacious. And it was, and it failed. But you know, it probably from here on it was going to stay the way Eisenhower wanted. It did stay the way Eisenhower wanted. Broad front movements. There's some other questionable decisions made on the strategies I have, but you know, this is I'd say Monty's last hurrah.
He thought they'd fly up that highway, all the bridges would be intact, they'd go straight on through, nobody's gonna do anything. They had no communication.
Yeah. If you wanted to know, if you wanted a study of how not to conduct an operation, I think this is a perfect model for it. And some of the key elements, you know, if you talk about principles of war and key elements of operation, this is a classic example of how things go wrong, can go wrong, and you don't have contingencies for it. And look at the outcome. You know, the casualty figures are just horrendous. Yes, sir.
Who picked the drop zones? Was that the commander, the division commander, or was that picked by Army commander?
I'd say Montgomery and his staff, and with input from the Airborne Army. Now, I don't know if I mentioned it here. Yeah, I do. Units. You know, your planners will look. You know, this is planned at Army level. and they looked at, well, we could have dropped them closer. Let's take Arnhem, for example. We could have dropped them closer to the objective. What would that do to affect the outcome, do you think? They were 6 miles from the objective. That's a pretty good distance in airborne operation planning, because you're on foot most of the time. Well, they did have some vehicles they got in and drove off, but that's a factor. Now, I'd say, me personally, I want them closer, because one thing you do to defeat an airborne force is you attack right away into it before it can reorganize. And if they're out there 6 miles away reorganizing, they've got a long way to go to get to the objective. And a lot of things can happen between there and the drop zone of the objective. So I'd say that was a bad choice. But the reason they did that, somebody probably said, you know, if we drop them closer, we have to consider the flak. There was flak around the bridge area, and they figured there's less flak units further out. And then they'd figure who'd ever plan to drop that far out. So, you know. Yes, sir.
I served with the 11th Airborne. We trained to drop at 500 feet. In comparison with the drop that they made in Normandy, the Air Force, when they got over the drop zone, they're supposed to throttle down to 90 to 100 miles an hour. They not only climbed over 1,200 feet, but they increased their speed to 120, which when you jump out and you get the prop blast and your opening shot, you lose half your material of the stuff that's strapped to you. The drop zones were small, and at that speed, you missed them. A lot of men were grounded, landed in trees, and you're talking 6 miles. Some of the planes that were in that operation, the men were dropped 60 miles from their drop zone. It was, I don't know what this market gun was, but I know I learned how to do it. It compared the two operations.
Okay. Normandy was a night drop. That inherently brings more problems to you. And also, the cloud banks were affecting over Normandy, the drop zone areas. There was clouds that were affecting the pilot's ability to identify and coordinate the drop zones where they had to be to get the troopers out. When the anti-aircraft fire began, most of those pilots had not had experience in combat drops. That was their proving ground for many of them. So when they started getting fired on, their first action was to get up high and go fast and get those troops out, regardless of where they were. So that contributed to the distances those troops were from their drop zones. But if you look at the plans for the drop zones, let's take St. Mary of Leeds, those drop zones were maybe a mile, at the most 2 miles from St. Mary of Leeds. Which, you know, you have to factor in, there's no fixed rule for how far they should be. You have to consider the enemy's disposition, maybe the weather factors and other factors, and what the objective is. So those entered into it. Now, Market Garden was a beautiful day. Nobody could miss the drop zone. Nobody did miss the drop zone. 80% of the drops were right on target. 86%. That's pretty high success rate for a drop. And it was perfect weather, not a lot of wind, nobody firing at you, and so the pilots could do what they would normally want to do and drop at the right altitudes, whether it be 500 to 800. That had an effect on the effectiveness, or I should say the success of the drops at Market Garden. Much better. If you looked at the comparison, there would be none in terms of the day versus night and the experience factor, too, of the pilots. That would make a big difference.
Did you run into any of Rumbles asparagus?
No. No, not there. In Normandy they did. But then Rollo was dead by this time. Well, yeah. He was gone. Yes, sir.
All of this went on Market Garden in about 10 to 12 days. And by the looks of that, within about 10, 15 miles. Was there anything of any importance going on the Russian front or the Italian front?
Yeah. Well, there was the Russians were still attacking on the east. And that was a factor, of course, in how forces were moved back and forth. That was 64 miles, that whole route, okay? Which would be a trip you might take in an hour and a half today, or less. But there were other things that mitigated the outcome of that. And there was the distance, not so much the distance, but what they had to get over to get there. Now, Rommel's asparagus, no, because the Germans really didn't have a lot of time to prepare defenses here. You know, they were in the retreat mode. If you remember what I said earlier, up till early September, they were just hauling ass for you, hauling you know what, to get back to the right. You know, they were getting clobbered, and they weren't taking a lot of time to set up strong defensive positions. Not like they did in Normandy. Normandy, they had years to prepare. And when Rommel came, of course, they flooded the dikes, they flooded the paddies, and they put up the asparagus and other obstacles. They didn't have a lot of time to do that here. What they had here was armored forces that we didn't expect them to have. Some did, but some, the leaders, the decision makers didn't follow through and make the right decisions. Yes, sir?
From various sources, we've learned that Montgomery always had a profound distrust of Ultra. Did that play any role in the intelligence problems here?
Not to the best of my knowledge. I think if there's anything, it was distrust of any you know, you have Ultra, but you need other sources to corroborate. You know, it's one thing to get these intercepts, but then it's another thing to have visual intel and other factors. So you look at other sources. As far as I know, that and I not read anything that Montgomery didn't trust Ultra. I don't think he cared what the intel told him. This operation was going to go one way or the other. You know, that's my gut feeling about it. Because, you know, when that intelligence officer came up to I guess it was Urquhart at the first British Airborne headquarters in England, and he said, hey, you know, look at these recon photos. They've got photos here of these armor formations around Arnhem. And next thing you know, this guy's being taken outside and recommended for some medical attention because he's battle fatigued or something. You know, he's not clear in his thinking. And yet it was to me an obvious observation that I'd want to follow up on. And if there was any follow-up, it didn't matter because it was going to go one way or the other.
He had the whole outfit psyched up that they were going to go regardless of what.
I think he said, well, we can deal with it. You know, we still got the air. Now, one thing they didn't, well, weather. Weather was horrendous over England for this particular phase, this week. Think about it as a 9-day but a week operation. The weather was bad, and I'm sure there was experts and weather guys that could tell them it was going to be bad, which mitigated the ability to fly, get air off the ground, first of all, and number two, over the area itself, some problems, and you can't get the good air support. You know, the Battle of the Bulge, for example, what was the success of the operation for the Germans up until a few days before Christmas? Bad weather. We couldn't fly our fighter bombers in to give close air support. Plus the fact that the air support wouldn't happen anyway in Arnhem because the radios weren't working.
Another thing, Bill, he wouldn't allow any American correspondence in this. All British correspondence to report on.
Oh, okay, that's a good point. I had not noted that, but I come here to learn too. Yes, sir.
Is this the same, Ultra that the, British had captured from a German U-boat? Or is this a different,
I don't know about that. To be honest with you, I couldn't comment on that. I know it's, Ultra was a system that these great analytical mathematic minds came up with at Bletchley Park in England.
No, the naval codes are different from the Army codes.
So, thank you. Yes, sir.
Coles originally got designed the Ultra, and they gave it to the breadstand.
Did it?
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. Yes, sir.
I was fortunate in September of '89 to go to the 45th reunion of Market Garden. Just by dumb luck, I got a room in the hotel at Osterbeek. So I was there in the midst of all these British paratroopers. And there was some interesting, and they allowed me to go with them to the ceremonies for the next 3 days. And there were some interesting comments. Most of them were pretty upset at the fact they considered it an intelligence failure that they did not know that SS division was sitting there. And they weren't so annoyed with Montgomery as being a poor planner as the airborne troops were against their armored forces and their inability to get up there and get to that bridge on time. I would say about 3/4 of these gentlemen that were there, the reason they survived is they were captured and they surrendered to the SS. And they all said they were treated fairly by the SS. No atrocities, no summary executions like some of the SS units that practice elsewhere. And the ones though that had to swim the Rhine to escape, they had some pretty harrowing stories about whether they most of them would tell you, I don't know why I survived and my buddy drowned. It was a nightmare for them. But the funny thing is, the British with their traditional humor and the way that these old guys would look at that, they said, "Well, Mike, that's what we did to win the war." It was something. I've also talked to some of the Germans that fought against them, and they the thing there was they were just overwhelmed with all of a sudden here comes a whole army out of the sky, and again the lack of any German air support, and they were hoping that if they had caused significant casualties to the Allies, that maybe they could somehow come about for peace talks. The Germans wanted to try to stabilize the front along Germany's western border. But after this, you'll see the German, except for the Ardennes, that northern flank actually was open. I mean, there's speculation that, and that's the traditional invasion route of Europe. It's flat up there. It's ideal for armored, elements. And there was also some consideration to actually invade an area up there around Denmark and come in that way. But as you know, Eisenhower said that broad front, and even that avoid Berlin, also as a strategic objective. He wanted to destroy the Wehrmacht. He didn't really care about the capture of Berlin.
Well, Berlin, yeah.
Berlin would have been a huge casualty causer, as the Russians found out. But Arnhem was like a mini Stalingrad, the way they fought in there, and the Germans certainly respected them. And those SS units, the Waffen-SS, were professionals. Contrary to the assumption, if it's an SS unit, it's going to be a murderous, no holds barred kind of unit, which is not true. Planning, just a couple highlights of things. The resistance, yes, might have been compromised, but certainly you have ways of validating information. Time to train. Units. The 1st British Airborne Division. This was their first time in battle as a division, and the unit was relatively untested, and staffing experiences factored in, should have factored in. And the question is, these are questions that I just leave you with, because I expect you to go back and search further. Why a unit like that could take the primary objective without the experience factor at the staff command level of it as a division? 82nd at Nijmegen. I think without the 325 at Nijmegen, the tasks given to the 82nd were a little bit too much. Not just taking the bridges they had to take, the 2 bridges plus, no, 3 bridges actually, plus take the heights over at Groesbeek. And I think that caused that delay in getting that bridge taken on day 1, which factored in, as we saw, to the backup, 36-hour backup of the whole plan, which is not that alone, but that's one factor. Okay, let me see if I can get some photos up, just to give you some idea. I've done a tour there. I do it quite often, and it's always a joy to see the battlefield and also the museums. They got some wonderful museums in that area. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it. And you're interested in, of course you're interested in World War II, that's why you're here, to tour that area. It's, and the Dutch are wonderful people. We'll see how good my, yes?
Which town is it that, is it Vest or Somme that's infatuated with 101st?
Vest.
Yeah, you go through, I mean, this is an area that really appreciates the Americans. And that town, you go through and on their buildings, they'll have little, pictures, the insignia, the Screaming Eagle, with airborne over the thing.
I have to tell you a little story. We were on the tour, and the guy I was working with, another friend of mine, a historian, he was the 82nd Association historian. We're up near the drop zones, just outside Eindhoven, in the area of Vest. There's a great museum in Vest, too. But anyway, this huge field that one of my travelers was a veteran of the 101st. He jumped in to Market Garden. And we go down this road, as you said, and you see these 101st markers, on the buildings, on the house. There's a memorial. So we just decided to pull in one place, and we walked up to look at this, and I might have a picture of it. Let's see. Okay, we got the one up. Well, this was Murray Moorhatch. He was with the 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment and the Brothers. And he dropped on this field back there. That's the drop zone for the 101st, one of the drop zones. And you see, I don't know if we have it here. Go to the second one, Laura. Yeah. That's what they had in the yard. This lady, I'm sorry I didn't bring her picture. God bless her. She's gone now. But she had this big plaque of the 101st Crest on her door, above her door. And we walked up and just, we said, look, we're traveling here, doing touring, and she invited us in, had tea and coffee and some pastries, and she says, she told us the story. She was a young girl on September 7th, and she saw these paratroopers come down. She just, we're liberated. Same kind of experience in Normandy. And she was just such a gracious host, and she had 101st guys coming back all the time to her house. That was like one of the places you hang out if you're a 101st veteran. And it's true through the whole area. The reverence and respect for the unit. It just makes you feel good to be in America. But that's the one of the memorials they put in the yard. Well, this is how to see. Well, go ahead. Just pop the next one. That's the bridge in Arnhem. Okay. Now it's been rebuilt, of course, but to the same design as the original bridge during the battle. On the far side is the south side the Germans held, the north side Frost had. Next one. This is the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek. You've been to that. I've heard, Laura, you just got there, right? Laura and her World War II tours. They've improved the bottom of the museum. Yeah. Quite an experience that my friends told me about. But that was the headquarters for the division at Oosterbeek. That's where Urquhart hung out. I don't know if this is best or not. This is one of the museums, and of course the C-47 Skytrains. You'll see them dotting all over the place. They really go all out there. That's the Son, well, that's today the Son Bridge that was blown up at Eindhoven. Or at Son, I'm sorry. That was over the Wilhelmina Canal. It's a lift bridge, of course, but that's what's replaced the bridge that was gone, blown away. The Grave Bridge on the Maas River, that was an 82nd Airborne objective. Pretty good sized span. To bridge that waterway with Bailey bridges would have taken a long time, maybe been a more challenge than you would imagine. And the last one is the Nijmegen Bridge. That's where the 82nd 505 took the south and the 504 2nd took the north side. And they finally achieved that. Okay. Just a footnote. If you're interested in information, between Laura and myself, we're kind of co-coordinating tours. And she's doing more than I am right now because she's more energized, right? Stand up, Laura. Laura Pascarello. She's great technical support and a tour operator. And if you'd like to get on our mail list, just give us your information, and we'd be happy to keep you posted on what we're doing in World War II in Europe. And I want to thank you all again for having us here. It's been a pleasure as always.
And don't forget, when we keep this thing going, I forgot the helmet tonight, so I'm passing the bucket.
Well, we're next to the last pitch for Pearl Harbor. We still have next month, I'll be reminding you, but I have the flyers. Unfortunately, Bob did put the box in my car, so the box is all the rest. This is all I have tonight, but we'll have more next month. Most of you already know that, so there should be a good here. And one last pitch for our Community Days books. $5, you get a $10 coupon, it's next weekend, and all of the money goes to the Pearl Harbor program and buy Christmas presents for veterans of the VA. So $5 a piece. And anybody that didn't get one last month, even if you got one last month, get another one. You can use one on each purchase you make per month. It's all $10 a month.
Don't forget, Mr. Light's books are here. If you're interested in
Doesn't say the spike. The spike looks for Ranger. See, this is a piece of junk through that. They had to work with it. You know, there's the chamber.
So the Brits, really the British stores are doing it. So rather than throw them away, they just issued them. And that's
High power, Browning.
great. I'm gonna need a lot of help. Great.
42, and I think it's the Australian, because they were still making the SMLE. That's the first.
Jackson, we need to find to go to Cancun.
I didn't bring it.
Are you Rolf? Your name Rolf?
Nope, Dan.
Dan, okay.
This thing really makes a noise.